On that note, there were sort of four main points of what we hope the work could help accomplish that were set out from the beginning. One was looking at products and what needs to be built, or where do we think this innovation is going? And so I think that fits there. But more broadly, how can our work help policymakers? What factors are driving Bitcoin adoption? And then, as I was kind of just saying, what are some broader implications for this space moving forward? And then finally, let's just educate each other. Let's share what's going on, and really, have something to point to about this space. Because once we have, if we think about Bitcoin as this protocol for truth and a way to transfer value and information across the world, with this study as well, let's get the truth. Let's get the information, the facts, so that then we can really best react and plan moving forward.
All right, now we're live. So thank you, ladies, so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk about surveys, my passion, and nerd out on maybe not data this time, but some of the experiences you had collecting data around Bitcoin adoption and use and around the world. So before we get started, maybe you want to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe your background on the project.
Yeah, Ella, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. My name is Ella Hough, and Renee, thank you so much for having Professor Kreps and I am a senior at Cornell and a junior fellow at the Cornell Brooks Tech Policy Institute. And I have the incredible job of being able to work with Professor Kreps on this study.
Thanks, Ella and Renee, and I'm delighted to be here. So I'm at Cornell also. I direct the Tech Policy Institute in the Brooks School of Public Policy, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And I thought it might make some sense to say a little bit or do a little bit of foregrounding of the project to give some context about how this had come about. And then I would turn it over to Ella to give some preliminary evidence and details about the work that she's done on the project. So does that all sound good?
Perfect.
Okay. So it was a very fortuitous encounter. Well, I've known Alex Gladstein at the Human Rights Foundation for a few years, but we were stuck together after Bitcoin Atlantis in a lovely city of Lisbon. So our flight was canceled coming back from the conference, and we had 7 hours to just kind of hang out. And during the course of our hangout, he had talked about this idea he had of not just thinking through why people use Bitcoin around the world, but the different modalities, and to actually put evidence behind these stories. Because we go to conferences, we read the news, we have some ideas and some narratives in our heads. And he said that he had been thinking about partnering with an academic institution that does survey work to actually do cross-national surveys about who uses Bitcoin, who knows about Bitcoin around the world, and see how it varies across different countries and different contexts. And I said, well, that's really coincidental and fortuitous and serendipitous and all those great words, because that's the kind of work we do in the Tech Policy Institute. Is we look at new, different technologies. Bitcoin is like obviously sort of not an emerging technology, but it was. I'm involved in our fintech initiative at the Johnson School, and Alex and I had been on panels before. But a lot of my work is public opinion work. How does society respond to new things? And one of these not new things, but something that, has kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of its novelty, but is Bitcoin. And for people who, listen to our webinars, they don't think of this as new, but in a lot of places around the world, its sort of use case is relatively novel and politically contingent. And so he said it would really, really great if we could actually have evidence on this. And he had sort of looked into, this question of how you would do surveys around the world. He had actually gone out and gotten some quotes. So I really want to give Alex a lot of credit for this project. And we then, so we started talking, we started putting our heads together and talking about this project. We then partnered also with the Reynolds Foundation, so Alvaro's group, in to pull this all together. And what I suggested to Alex at the time in this conversation in Lisbon was it would be really interesting to not just do quantitative study, but to actually put some kind of flesh on the bones and actually build some stories and understand from people who actually use Bitcoin kind of what their use cases are. And the great thing about our institute and an academic institution like ours is that we have such incredible human capital and intellectual capital. And so Ella, who was also at the conference, I had just seen her and I thought this would be really like a really cool project for us to work together on. And so I think in a subsequent webinar, I'll talk about the statistical part of this, the quantitative part of it. But just to kind of foreshadow that for the future, a little teaser here. So Alex had thought about doing maybe 12 countries. The more we got into this, I thought, well, let's do 25. So we've done 25 surveys, which is a lot of work, as you know, Renee, because you've done survey work. It's just like translating all these surveys and kind of sometimes technical wording into Tagalog. And Hindi is not necessarily easy. So, but we've done that, and we're starting to get preliminary results in. But alongside that survey work is the project and part of this that Ella has done over the last, 7 months, which is just an impressive amount of a number of interviews with people. So I think with that backdrop, I want to hand it over to Ella so she can talk about and answer questions about that really impressive amount of volume of work that she and this team of students has done.
So Ella, I would love to hear how you got brought into this and kind of your initial thoughts when you were approached with it, where you're like, oh my God, no. Or was it like, yeah, it's amazing? Because I'm guessing you probably don't have a background in survey methodology or, that kind of thing.
No, I certainly do not have a background in any survey methodology, and I have learned a ton from Professor Kreps and some of the other professors that have been working on actually building out the survey and doing the kind of literature review on how do we structure these questions and what are other methodologies that have been used. But I think it really began, the first contact, I saw that Professor Kreps was joining the Bitcoin Policy Institute as a fellow. And I reached out and I said, oh my gosh, this is, incredible. I didn't know there was anyone else at Cornell, especially a professor that was interested in Bitcoin, thinking about it. Would you join as the advisor of the Cornell Bitcoin Club that I had just started? And I don't think a professor has ever responded faster. I think it was like 5 minutes. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like this is incredible. So that was, I guess, part one. And then we met in person, I think, for the first time at Bitcoin Atlantis in Madeira. And we got back, let's see, that was in like March-ish. I think spring break was around and we got back to campus and I think we had a meeting and it was like, oh, let's do this study and can we involve, it's now kind of 13 students from the Bitcoin Club to help and lead the interview portion of the study. And so, that's been really meaningful as well I have more familiarity with Bitcoin than some of the other students. And so to provide this opportunity of here, you can talk to people in these countries that are using Bitcoin and learn from them. I think it's been really meaningful and an impactful opportunity for those students as well to have. So yes, certainly didn't know much going in, but I've learned a lot, which I'm most grateful for. Still not an expert, but, learning. Yes.
So I would love to hear a little bit about, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, would you like me to kind of dive into how the interviews, how this process has looked, and some of
Yes. I was just
how
going to
that's
say, I
been
would
done.
love to hear about the methodology and kind of, like how, maybe even how, what you started out thinking it was going to be, and if anything changed over time, like what did it actually end up being? So yeah, feel
Yeah,
free to take it wherever you want in terms of how you actually got this off
yeah,
the ground.
will do, absolutely. So, as Professor Kress mentioned, we were going to start with about 12 countries and then ramped it up to 25. And with that, right now we're trying to do 250 interviews. So about 10 people for each one of those countries. And we're also looking at, students, business owners, entrepreneurs, professors, merchants, everyday citizen, people kind of from all walks of life and society to really help us get the true story of what's happening on the ground and be really
These are the people
conscious
you're targeting for interviews, or that's,
for
yeah.
interviews.
And you're trying
Exactly,
to get like
yes.
a range of different people. Yeah.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yes. So I'll just set it up again. So we have 10 people, ideally, per country. So it's 250 total. But within, who makes up that 10 group in that country, we don't want it, for instance, to be all Bitcoiners or all students. We want to make sure we're really hearing as many voices so that we can contextualize this survey data. And as Professor Kreps was saying, really get the story. And so with that, when we first started going about it, I would say it was, I didn't really quite know the best way to organize these interviews, literally from the actual organization of it. And so, how do we make the connections to the people? How do we connect with students? And we ended up having to take a lot of inspiration sort of from just Bitcoin itself and the values that the are really stressed in the industry, privacy, peer to peer. How can we really embody some of that ethos? And so, actually, I don't know if it would be helpful, but would you like me to share kind of a diagram of what this process looks like?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so let me just press screen share here so that we can see more of an overview. At first, I would say it was a little bit scattered of a process, and we were losing people in the mix. They weren't quite sure, can we trust this person? What is really going on here? And so now there is, I just want to confirm that you all can see this.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. So, well, actually, let me go back. So this is our team that we have here. So there are a lot of making this happen. And let's see, this is loading. But we have a lot of people
Just looking
involved
at this
making it.
briefly,
Yeah.
are these all Cornell students?
Yes. So
Exactly.
exactly.
Everyone under you, basically.
Everyone
Okay.
under me. Everyone under me. And something that's nice as well, because the Cornell Bitcoin Club, it's meant for all kind of majors or different groups on campus. We have people from the business school or the law school that are involved. And so they also all are assigned 5 countries to focus on. And so that's, you can kind of see it under their names. And the reason that we did that, that was another learning. At first, I was just connecting people as we would, get a contact. But by purposefully assigning students countries to focus on, we're hoping that that will help us gain better regional insights and just make connections that otherwise perhaps we would have missed. And so that is something that we modified later on and which has been helpful thus far. And so this here, it's actually very small, but I will just generally explain how this works. So I kind of reach out to who we might call as like a finder. And this is someone that I know in the Bitcoin community or maybe outside of Bitcoin, and say, hey, this is the study we're doing. Is there any way you can help me find people in this country where you live that kind of fill these different buckets of society of people that we were looking at, as I touched on earlier? And then they will respond back. Bitcoiners are very helpful. Everyone responds back and says, yes, I'm happy to help. And then they connect me with that person or those group of people. I reach out to that person again, kind of establish trust, answer questions. What are we hoping to get out of the information that they might provide, and then ask if it's one, if they're okay participating, and then two, may I connect them to one of the Cornell students that are helping us with the study, and then they pretty much always say yes. And then the student reaches out and sets up an interview. And then when the
Do you have a
student
rough
has, yeah,
sense of like the response rate? Like what percentage of people said yes? Do you have a rough idea?
actually, I have not quantified that, but I do have it all tracked, so I could get the number. I think 99% have said
I mean, that's
yes.
amazing. That's so high compared
Yeah,
to other surveys, right? So I think even that in itself just
yeah,
shows, Bitcoiners' willingness to help out and, be part of
yeah.
a larger community. So
Yeah,
that's so cool.
exactly. Yeah, no, I'm very grateful. There is kind of on the second layer of when we get a recommendation to someone, that one it drops more often than I don't think I've ever gotten a no on someone not wanting to do an interview. There's just no response. And so then kind of follow up like one more time, but then kind of take it as a polite no, and we move on to try to find someone else.
Yeah.
And another thing that I started doing as well is try to be conscious of what medium we're communicating over. And so it's very across all the different countries. Like I think I communicate with people across probably 5 different apps and methods. Um, and I just, if I reach out to someone, maybe all I have is their Twitter, I'll include like, oh, this is my signal. This is like an encrypted email. And then some people will then choose one of the other options to communicate on. And so I think those little things also perhaps help our response rate, where you just try to make people feel more comfortable because this is sensitive information. And so that is something that we implemented later on as well. And then the final stage here is really the student does that first interview with the person in the country or the connection. And then from that point on, they've built that relationship. They can ask that person, hey, we're still looking for someone in, this category. Do you have a recommendation? Would you be able to connect me with anyone? And then they can completely own that relationship and conversation. And so I don't put myself in the middle to just have it all coming through me. And as soon as yeah, I don't want to hold anyone up or be a reason anything stalls. It's just when we first started doing this, I think there was just missing that link of trust or, oh, you're a
Yeah.
peer of my peer. I see how this is connecting. And so
And
then
these
from,
interviews
yeah,
they weren't in person, right? They were, over like something like this where it's
yeah.
Zoom or whatnot. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they've all initially in the very origin, we thought, oh, it would be really cool if students could go to the countries and do the interviews in person. But honestly, they can be done pretty well digitally, virtually, and we have so many different time zones that we're interacting with and coordinating. The students themselves can have a lot of flexibility on when they do the work and what time works for them. And then after the interview is done, all of the students do kind of 3 things. A notes document of, their answers to it's about 10 questions that people ask during the interview. However, they have flexibility to add in some more if there's something that's unclear or if there's a thread they feel there's, something insightful to pull on. And then they also do a write up, and this one includes some of those standout quotes because as we think about what does this final report look like? How are we going to compile it? Again, providing the stories, we really want to capture kind of the emotion, or really, why someone is choosing to use Bitcoin or not use Bitcoin. And then kind of asked to send a thank you note to follow up with people there. But that is pretty much the process on the interviews. And it is a bit slower than I first thought, just because there's a lot of intermediary steps to go through. But we've certainly, I feel really lucky to kind of then go back through and read through them, and happy to share some of those insights as well. Or we can continue to kind of talk about, yeah.
Do the interviewers, do they go through all 10 questions, or is it kind of like see where the conversation takes you? Or
Yeah,
pick and choose?
so I'll just stop sharing this one so that I can see you all again. So it's yes and no. So the one question, for instance, is how much of your wealth is in Bitcoin, in crypto? And this one, I sort of built in a note, you can double remind the person they don't need to answer that if they don't feel comfortable with doing that. And so some people will say, I just prefer not to share on that question. But they are generally pretty vague, or not vague, but broad, the questions. So it's, what are challenges that you're seeing or catalysts to adoption? When did you first learn about Bitcoin? How did you first learn about Bitcoin? Do you think you use Bitcoin similar to how others in your country use it? And it's cool when you ask that question, like, do you use it similar to others? And then you see kind of the interviews stacked of people answering that one. And so, I think we have a huge amount of data that we're acquiring on the qualitative and quantitative side. And so it'll be, a really exciting process to really gather all of the insights from it over the next, I guess, year and a half-ish.
I mean, it's super exciting because then other people can build on that data as well, right? It's such this
Exactly.
rich source of information that is going to be
Yes,
very, I think, instrumental to the Bitcoin community. So it's so exciting
exactly.
that
Yeah.
you were able to get this off the ground and going, and that now you have the data and and some real world tangible results. And then you also, I love that you can build these qualitative experiences around it too. So it's not just strictly numbers and graphs, since you can
Mhm.
kind of flesh it out a little bit more,
Yeah.
which
And
really
because,
helps with the insight.
yeah, Bitcoin, I think it's about people. One of the biggest takeaways I've seen from the data that we have thus far and the interviews that have come through, like, it is in the US especially, we kind of can see the number go up, or kind of Bitcoin strategic reserve, or we see
Mhm.
that use case more predominantly. But doing these interviews, seeing the data, like, Bitcoin really is being used as this peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It is being used as a kind of a tool in that sense, as freedom go up technology. And so that's been really nice to see as well.
What are some of the things you learned around doing these interviews? Was there anything that maybe you had to change as you got started, that you found like get people to talk and be more open, or that maybe you realized you had to include another question that you weren't thinking about? Or was there any insights you gained from doing these qualitative interviews?
Yes, so many. I would say one one question that I added in at the end was just anything else. A very simple question, anything else you didn't get a chance to share, because some people then would go down, all of these other. Like, I'll give you a tangible example. So in Turkey, someone was talking about the how basically Bitcoin is the kind of the investment case for it, because all of their other assets have been devalued. So actually, maybe this is an interesting comparison. So in South Korea, someone kind of under the anything else category was talking about how most people, or average person, makes between like 40 to 50,000 USD, but they live in an apartment that might be, $1.5 million. And for them, real estate is much more prevalent especially after kind of the collapse of Terra Luna and Do Kwon, and basically South Korea really heavily regulating anything against blockchain, Bitcoin, people just really going more towards real estate was an interest. But then you go to Turkey, and someone was saying, oh, no, real estate isn't as large here. People do see kind of the greater case for Bitcoin as this means of preserving wealth. And also, they brought up an interesting regulation where it came from the capital markets side, and it was concerned with the payments and transacting, so kind of layer two. And they said, yep, we don't think the government will regulate much on layer one, but they want to press more regulations on layer two and kind of using Bitcoin as payments technology and transacting. And so there's all of these, I don't know, little stories that I've started to see develop differently across the countries through them, just by asking the anything else question, which I'm glad I asked that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great thing to add at the end of a qualitative interview for sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you maybe want to talk about some high level like results or things you've learned from these qualitative interviews, or kind of some themes you've seen, or even by region?
Yeah, for sure. So maybe just really high level, kind of on the catalysts and challenges side of things. So right off the bat, people say price speculation is a big catalyst. When the price goes up, more people come in and more interested. It's on the question of where did you learn about Bitcoin? I think pretty much everyone so far has said they learned about it from a friend or some grassroots means someone told them about it,
Yeah.
which is interesting as well. And then they also kind of were talking about education, and not just education about what Bitcoin is, but someone in India was really specifying I don't see this as an investment. I see this as money. And people don't teach, in any curriculum really across the world, education about what money is. And so just hearing them talk, it's not just education about Bitcoin that's needed, but really Bitcoin as money, what is money? But on that note, much of the current education, I mean, it's getting better, but it's been in English or, not in many, many different types of languages. And so that has also been a challenge of how can we provide better quality information, counter misinformation. A lot of people were saying that YouTube was their go-to source of education, but we know if you go on YouTube, there's a lot of not good out there. And so how do you filter that? And then regulations has been another big, actually it came up under catalysts and challenges as well. People saying, oh, if the government puts forth favorable regulation to Bitcoin, then I would be more likely to accept or adopt it. Especially, this is where the culture context comes in. This was really prevalent in Japan. People saying, look, it's just not in our nature to go against what we've been told. We want to follow the, rules more broadly. And so if there's favorable regulation, another layer to that, a lot of people were talking about the US and how the US approaches Bitcoin regulation, which I think comes with an interesting, maybe, I don't know if dilemma is the right word, but what I took away from that is we are the country that kind of sets the tone, but we're also not the country with the majority of the problems or the pain points that people are feeling. And so in order to really get like this tool solution to people, it's like it has to be like dictated or the messaging set by someone that doesn't even have the more urgent problem that was
So that means
something.
policymakers here really need to be thinking
Yeah.
about the policies they set being inclusive of everyone globally and their
Mhm.
situations, financially and, how they're dealing with high inflation, or maybe they don't have other investments, or they actually need this as a way to make payments peer to peer. Right.
Yes,
So
exactly. And
it's
so,
really critical we get it
yes.
right.
And so, that's why what you all did last week with Bitcoin for America and just all the work you do on a daily basis is so important, because reading, these interviews from people, they say, look, our government cares about what the US is doing. I follow, the US election more closely than anything else happening in my own country. Um,
So,
Not
I mean,
directly
about that,
related.
do
Yeah.
they, I'm just wondering, like there's a lot of people do have a negative perception towards the current president. Would that change? And maybe there's no way to gauge this from your survey, but I'm just wondering,
Mhm.
would that change their feelings about Bitcoin? So it's like, oh, President Trump is like pro crypto, pro Bitcoin. Maybe we should stay away from it. Do you think that's an impact anything, or do you think they're more neutral and they're just kind of looking at the country as a whole? Okay, the U.S. is doing favorable legislation. They think it's a good asset.
Mhm.
We should, think about this more holistically.
Yep. We didn't ask in the interviews any question of, what is your political preference or anything very specific there. I do believe in the survey question, I need to check this. There was a question for the US of who did you vote for, or, and I think more broadly of what is your general political leaning for other countries. I might be wrong on that. But I don't think it's really in the weeds of, uh, from what I can tell from the interviews, it was much more, how is this solving a problem for me? Less, red versus blue in the US, but just, can I, think about tomorrow? And is this going to help me build a life for my kids or, my family? There was a quote from someone in Argentina, and they were talking about how they raise kids to save US dollars in piggy banks. They don't teach them how to save in a,
Okay, so
traditional bank.
yeah.
Exactly. And so, you read things like that, and it's like, it's really about, how can I just fulfill my humanity and, have my family work, feel fulfilled. I just don't think there's that, like a real emphasis on real problems and how do we solve these is
Right.
my takeaway.
Because you don't want it to be
Yeah.
tainted if people have a negative perception about an individual and then,
Hmm.
they decide that, okay, we don't. Because we see that a lot in the US, I think, unfortunately. So I'm glad that you didn't really necessarily see that in other countries. And
Yeah,
it's funny because
certainly.
you think about like saving in dollars in the piggy bank, and now, I'm trying to get my kids to save in sats, right? in the
Yeah,
digital piggy bank. So
I know. Yeah. And then I think, some other interesting takeaways. Um, Awareness doesn't necessarily mean people are very knowledgeable, or trusting towards it. So to kind of prep for the webinar, I focused on like 8 different countries across various, do they have a CBDC? What's their property status, inflation, just to try to get a sense. And of those 8 countries, South Korea had the highest awareness and belief of Bitcoin crypto, but like the lowest actual usage or trust in that. And then I also pulled China, and China had like one of the lowest, it was an interesting case, like one of the lowest awarenesses, but of the people that were aware, the most knowledgeable and also the most usage and ownership. And so, there's an interesting dynamic there, especially if you look at El Salvador, for instance. Like, okay, let's say we do, I guess at the time, have favorable policy and regulation to, use Bitcoin, transact in Bitcoin, save in Bitcoin, but the adoption was still pretty low compared to the others. And so this, I don't want to plant an idea of, oh, we just have regulation, like we have a stamp of approval, we're set. I still think, talking about Bitcoin's ethos, the kind of permissionless nature, and really, opting into a system, how is this fixing a problem for me? That is still kind of a powerful messaging across the countries of, I have a problem, how do I fix this? So that was interesting to see as well.
And also tying back to what you said about the how do people hear about it, grassroots, right? So it really does need to be
Mhm.
the grassroots thing, that it comes from the ground and the people. And yeah, you're right. I don't think legislation isn't all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're not going to be magically everyone on the Bitcoin standard or using Bitcoin, right? It doesn't, not going to
Yeah.
quite work that way. So
And I guess one final big surprising fact that I saw, it's like more than 60% across the board in countries don't know there's a supply cap. Like they don't
interesting.
know there's, yeah, the knowledge of that there's only 21 million Bitcoin is in like the 30s, 40s. So, to the education point, kind of Bitcoin's achievement of digital scarcity, we haven't even really scratched the surface, I think, in articulating what that means and how that changes your ability to, you know, have a sound financial footing.
Yeah, that's crazy because I mean maybe they just are seeing the historical gains, or that number go up to the right.
Hmm. Yeah.
And they're not and they haven't had the time to dig into why, right? So Bitcoiners
Hmm.
are often like, we've gone down the rabbit hole and we're in the weeds about like what is money, and the
Yeah.
printing of the government, and that 21 million is really important to us. But I think probably some people who are living day to day and just like see this as like a lifeboat maybe haven't had the time to really dig in, right? So
Exactly. It makes sense. If you are experiencing this immense inflation and all of these pressures of your day to day, it's unrealistic that, you have time to
mhm.
study.
100 hours of
um,
Bitcoin podcast.
exactly. Yeah, that's completely unrealistic.
Yeah,
And the difficulty adjustment and,
yeah,
all of that.
yeah,
Um, certainly not the case.
yeah. You just want
Yes,
your $100 today to not be $25 tomorrow, and what can you do to make sure you save that value, right? And so just trying to find
exactly.
solutions that work. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yes.
So I was looking at your slides, and at some point I would love to go through the one on like the trustworthiness, how people view Bitcoin versus other currencies. But before we do
Yeah.
that, I'm wondering if there's maybe some other key points that you think would be good to go over from the survey, or things that you found.
Yeah, so this study does also include stablecoins, and maybe we'll just touch on this a little bit briefly, because it really didn't come up that much in the interviews thus far. People talking about stablecoins. I think there was one person in Ukraine that said, "I have 80% in stablecoins and 20% in Bitcoin." That was the most real prevalent use of people saying they use stable coins there. Um, and so that has been interesting. I was kind of under the impression that we would see much larger numbers just from the interviews, especially with the data that I think stablecoins did 2 or 3 times what Visa and MasterCard did in transactions last year in 2024. That's loosely correct. So that was just one. And, actually, maybe in the slides, may I show kind of a comparison of the awareness of Bitcoin versus crypto and stablecoins? Because I think that could be interesting as well.
And is this, maybe we should back up one step too, and just
Yeah.
kind of make it clear to the audience that there's kind of two parts to this survey, right? You have your quantitative part, which is I'm assuming it was like, well, actually we didn't really talk about the methodology of that, so maybe we should talk about that too. Like how many people were surveyed in each country, how was it, like random sampling, was it on the phone, that kind of thing. And so we're not really discussing those results today. That'll be for like webinar part 2, more kind of quantitative information. And then
Yeah.
there was a second part of this, which was the qualitative, which we have been talking about, which was the 250 people, 10 in each of these 25 countries, and kind of their feedback, right? You get kind of dig in depth.
Yeah.
So maybe do you want to talk real briefly about the quantitative side of things and how that was run, even though we'll come back to this in another webinar, just so we kind of separate the two.
Yes, I'd love to. So it's loosely 25,000 individuals, so about 1,000 across all of the countries. As it's actually executed, it's not a perfect 1,000 across all of the countries. Some have more Some have a little less, but that's generally the number. And, as Professor Kreps, I think, mentioned, this is the largest ever cross-national study of Bitcoin perceptions and behavior. And we hope that, it can be the first of many to really track how this changes over time as Bitcoin grows in adoption. And so that's just the very basis. But then actually, how did we select the countries that were included? This was not let's just look at a map and let's select the countries that we think will have interesting data, because again, we wanted to try to take away bias, really get into the nuance. And so we looked at, every country in the world was on the initial list of how are we going to score this. And then we looked at 18 different factors of interest to really decide on the 25 countries that would be included. So this covered inflation rate, banking access, remittances, the legal status of Bitcoin in the country, civil unrest, corruption, type of government. And that's how we honed in on the 25. And then further than that, and this is just sort of, I guess, what I was just saying, further, when we were constructing the actual survey that people receive, and I think it's a 21-page document, which it's kind of funny how that worked out. But there's 15 different categories that we are evaluating and looking at. And so this is including, topics like their awareness of Bitcoin versus crypto. Do they even know that there's perhaps a difference? How risky do they think Bitcoin is? I know you wanted to touch on that. What is their current trust of Bitcoin, trust in the current financial system? What is their just general financial knowledge? And so there's kind of some easy math questions towards the end of that. And then just kind of some personality data to them. And so there's a lot that's being collected, but hopefully that provides some good context or further context on that methodology, but happy to expand if you think there's an area too.
Awesome. I think that's a good overview for now. I think we'll get more into it in part 2 when we kind of go into the actual results. But yeah, is there any other, from going back to the qualitative interviews, any other kind of high level things that you learned that you think would be interesting to share?
I think I covered most of them, just kind of some of the general challenges, catalysts, some surprising facts from that. But one other high-level piece that I'd love to share is just regarding the awareness component, because I think that contextualizes, or it just kind of helps provide a good base layer. And so, I did include this overview of basically all of the countries and then their scoring against different factors. And so when we come down here to the ownership, you can see that Bitcoin owner or awareness is generally really high. In China, 69%, kind of was the lowest of these 8 countries that I just selected for a snapshot, but they're, up in the, high 90s, high 80s. Ownership drops much lower into kind of the low teens. And then even from that kind of lower number of ownership, the actual transacting is still fairly low, except for instance, China. So this is where I was touching on earlier, I thought was really interesting. The ownership was kind of at, the 29% previously owned it. We removed since it's technically banned, we removed that question for China and Hong Kong in the survey, but we can know from previous reporting that has been done. And then of that, more than half that owned Bitcoin used it once or twice a week, which is, that really surprised me to see that high of a number.
Yeah, I'm surprised too. So this wasn't from your survey. This is from previous data, like a previous survey that was.
Everything, but these 2 boxes.
Yeah. For China, I mean.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And then real quickly before we go into some of the riskiness piece, I just thought it would be interesting to show how awareness varies across Bitcoin and crypto broadly, Ethereum, and stablecoins. So people are generally pretty aware of Bitcoin and crypto equally for the most part. Look
But real
deeper
quick, can I
as
clarify? Is
to,
this
yep, yes,
sorry? Is this the
go ahead, Sarah.
25,000 kind of random sample, or is this
Yes,
the okay? Just making sure.
yeah,
Cool.
yes. So this is our data that is being collected, and so this is like of about 1,000 people per each one of these countries. So this is 8,000 people right here. So generally, people are equally aware of Bitcoin and crypto. But if you go a little deeper of, oh, are you aware of Ethereum? Are you aware of stablecoins? It really drops off. Um, and so
Interesting.
I think that is interesting. And on the stablecoin piece, which is why I pulled this up, not seeing much of stablecoins come up in the interview conversations. It really, when it comes up, it's about volatility and how can we escape some, the volatility that is prevalent in Bitcoin. But it's just lower than, the awareness level than I would
Yeah.
have thought. So,
I'm looking at
especially, yeah,
Argentina, and I'm looking
yes,
at stablecoins, only 43% aware. And like you hear all this rhetoric around they want the dollar, stablecoins are so popular and everyone uses it.
yeah,
But then your findings are actually less than half of the population is even aware of them, which is
yeah,
fascinating. So, and
yeah.
I'm really surprised about Switzerland. Only 1 in 4 Swiss, I'm assuming these were adults, are aware of stablecoins. So that's pretty wild.
Yeah,
So
and I
much.
think Switzerland had really low numbers, just general, like I think the number was 3% on transacting. Um, really low. And it's interesting because Switzerland, in places like it's Zug or Zug, Neuchâtel, uh, kind of, I think it's cantons, if I have my terminology right, have very favorable Bitcoin regulation. Like they're some of the first places where you could get paid in Bitcoin. Um, but it's pretty low still despite that.
Maybe they're just super happy with their Swiss franc. Who knows?
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
that's crazy.
yeah, and I don't know if this is a good analogy with stable coins, but I think about like the iPhone and how we didn't like now most they don't have a home button, and even when they had the home button, they didn't need to have it. They could have just gone, like BlackBerry keyboard to no buttons swipe, but they had to kind of wean people off of, needing a button or that familiarity. And Breeze and 1A, 1Z put out a good report a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, kind of looking at Lightning and this messaging of Bitcoin being used as this, peer-to-peer payments network. And they brought up how stablecoins provide like the bridge where it's like, I'm still getting, I think their words were, I don't have the FOMO of not being, on board of like, I think it was like crypto or digital assets. I can't remember the wording they used. But then people still realize the problems that it's not getting you out of inflating currency,
Mhm.
or it's still a
Mhm.
centralized system. And so it's like, I we hear again the narrative of, oh, stable coins, really help, and they found this product market fit, but I don't know if it's just going to be like the home button analogy, how long you're going to need that kind of bridge getting you from one system to another system. So it's all speculation on my part, but these numbers were just lower than I expected.
Yeah, me too. I'm really actually quite surprised that it looks like across the board awareness of Bitcoin is higher than stablecoins.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not have expected that actually. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's sometimes people say bad press is good press and rainy press is good press. There's a lot of press and narratives, some good, some bad around Bitcoin. So I guess in that way you might have heard of it or heard something about it. And just going up, the amount it has, like its
Mm-hmm.
rate of return is so much higher than other things, I suppose maybe people would be more likely to have heard of it. But yeah, I wouldn't have predicted such a big delta between the two. So
Yeah.
that's
Yes.
fascinating.
And then let me just quickly show these tiers because it'll make sense as we go through the riskiness level. How the surveys were actually issued and done. I believe it was kind of batched in these different tiers based on their freedom scores by Freedom House. And so in the following slides, that's just how they're categorized. But I think I'd maybe like to go to India to show that data, if that would sound good to you.
That sounds good. This is kind of like a little teaser for people for next time. We'll get more into the data. And do you have a rough idea when are you hoping to get the report out?
So it's May 2026-ish,
Awesome.
around
So
then.
very
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah. Well, so
So then
another
we
year.
can
Yeah.
dig in even more on this, and we'll have a second webinar to go over some
Yeah.
of the findings. But this is a little teaser for the next webinar. So go ahead on
Exactly.
India.
Yeah. So India, I think, is let me preface, one of the questions we asked is, how do you perceive Bitcoin's riskiness? And so, for instance, this question is, would you say that owning Bitcoin is higher risk, equal risk, or lower risk than, for instance, the Indian rupee? And other currencies as well. And so what's interesting here is that you see that 42% think owning Bitcoin is higher risk than the rupee. But if you combine the equal risk and lower risk, you get into, like 58% think it's, equal risk or lower risk, 28% thinking lower risk. And that aligns pretty closely with something that came up in the interviews as well. People talking about how gold has been very prevalent and how people see the value in gold and holding kind of a more sound asset. And I believe the numbers also 47% consider Bitcoin to be kind of trustworthy in India, and that was the highest of these 8 countries that we pulled for today. And so, as much as we have factors of inflation, remittances, government, culture plays a really big part in adoption and your using of Bitcoin. Another story from Indonesia was a person was sharing how Indonesia, Southeast Asia has a very strong gambling and kind of trading culture. And so for there, and they also, the term used was e-money. People are very familiar with kind of transacting just QR code digitally. So Bitcoin is just like trading, had a very prevalent use case. And so I think that's just one takeaway from all of this. It's that, the culture and the local area that you're in has a really large impact as well.
But even looking at this, it's fascinating that like more than half of the population think that Bitcoin is not more risky than their local currency, right? So it's equal or it's lower risk. So that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah. Yes. And so let's see, perhaps what would be most interesting to you to see in some of this data, some of the other countries with riskiness? Or
there was one slide in particular I think was really interesting. It was like it was bar charts going horizontal, and it was comparing different currencies. Let me see if I can find it as well. And I can tell you the slide number then.
Perfect.
I think it was slide 23.
23.
And I think that was maybe all 25,000 respondents. Is that right?
So this is just the US.
Oh, this is the US. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
this
Well,
is
even
just the
that's
US.
fascinating because that when I'm looking at this, that means Americans see Bitcoin, like more than half of Americans see Bitcoin less risky than something like the British pound or the euro or the yen or the Swiss franc or even stocks or the Chinese yuan. Like that's pretty wild. And I like that really surprised me. I would not have expected that. Because I mean, I live a little bit in a bubble. I'm in California. But when I talk to people, they're always talking about how it's risky or I don't understand it or it's volatile. And part of that, I think, is really strongly along gender dimensions. But just kind of looking overall, I really would not have expected these results. So these are
Yeah.
super interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'm paraphrasing. Someone in the interviews were talking about risk and uncertainty, and how. And this is someone I think had done more study, was more knowledgeable, but just didn't the volatility, that you do see in Bitcoin didn't phase them because they're like, look, I look at Bitcoin in the long term, it's up and to the right. It's not predictably going down as people increase the money supply. And so, this just goes again to the education level and really people thinking for themselves and forming their own opinions and what cultures really allow you to do that versus not.
Were Americans more aware that there was a cap on Bitcoin at 21 million compared to other countries?
So I looked. I didn't have the memo in the folder for the US to look at that, but here, I have it here, but I didn't have it in the same format as the others, and so I just didn't feel comfortable putting it in, looking at it. But over here, it's 84% familiar with Bitcoin, 76% with crypto. And then this is for the US for Americans, so more familiarity with Bitcoin. But I didn't have the data compared to kind of stablecoins or Ethereum. And I also, what did I put in the note here? Yep, US Bitcoin ownership is at 12%. And so it is just a little bit higher than Saudi Arabia, but falls under South Korea, Switzerland, many of these countries that
Well,
chose on
that's
here.
so interesting because look at Switzerland, and yet Switzerland
Yeah.
had the lowest awareness rate, right? And
Mm-hmm.
usage as well.
Yeah, so let me go back up to, Switzerland over here with 90% awareness of Bitcoin. I believe it was 3% usage. And then, actually, do I have it here? Oh, I was right. Okay, 3% use Bitcoin daily. So of the 18% in Switzerland that own it, 3% use it daily, 37% never use it. And so we know that. Oh, go ahead, Renee. Sorry.
No, I did.
Oh, the US, it was 12% ownership rate. And then let's look over here, which I think it was 84% if I have that.
I think I was thinking about the
awareness.
stable coins in Switzerland, the low, like the 25% awareness of stable coins. Yeah, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Yes. Another kind of final piece that's really interesting is people's perception of will Bitcoin replace or will crypto replace their currency? And I think Argentina, that number was like 60% think yes, will replace, the currency. I forget the timeline, but very high numbers.
You don't happen to have a slide for that, do you?
No, I
No
think,
pressure.
I don't have a slide for it, but I pull the data very quickly. Just stop sharing. But so, that's a factor that I think is interesting to look at because going back to, really the motivations behind this study is how can we inform policy? How is this industry developing? And so thinking about people's long-term perspectives and not just what's happening in the short term, that will be really interesting takeaways for us to see as well so that we can help help the policymakers craft better legislation and how they're thinking about the issue and really what their citizens are looking at. So let me see. I just pulled up Argentina's memo. And yes, so despite a lack of familiarity, 60% believe cryptocurrency will one day replace the Argentine peso as the primary currency, with 24% thinking it will happen within 10 years. Yes.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, we're just, you know, blessed with lots of data and insights to learn. And so it'll
Was
be,
thinking like, oh,
yeah.
well, maybe we need like 4 webinars, right? Because you have so
I
much information. It's
know.
all so interesting and like so much rich data. So do
Yeah.
you happen to have the numbers on the US? Like how many percentage of Americans think that crypto will replace the dollar? Or you can save it for next time if you don't.
I think I want to look and see if I have it so that we can share it because I think that will be interesting.
Yeah.
But it might fall into we need to save this for the next one. Um, but I'm pulling it up right now. Let's see. So the US, we'd included it as kind of like a test case or a baseline. But I think that was the first one we did survey data for. And then the others have been coming in their different tiers. And so I'm looking. Very oddly, I don't know where the memo is located in this folder for it because it's not with all of the others. So Sarah might have to share that in the
No
future one.
worries. So we'll save that for next time. Then that'll be an
Yeah,
interesting comparison. We can see how these different countries are thinking crypto might replace their native currencies.
yeah, yes, exactly.
So maybe in closing, we know that it's so important for policymakers in the US to get it right because it not just impacts Americans, it impacts everyone around the world, right? So we want to make sure
Mhm.
our policy is inclusive and is thinking about people not in privileged situations that have access to a bank account or maybe like have access to equities or bonds or other kind of savings, but people who don't have any of these things, right? Are there other use cases or outcomes that you're hoping that this data will inform? It could be anything from, like improving the Lightning Network or the apps we use or
Yeah.
security or anything. But going into this, was there anything that you or maybe HRF had really hoped this would help inform to improve, or maybe something that you've realized as you've started to process this data and think about it more broadly?
Yes, so certainly, what is the state of financial freedom? That has been a core focus of this. And, is Bitcoin being used as a tool for that today? So not just thinking about policy in the future, but what truly is the state of things. To your point about kind of products and, the accessibility of Bitcoin and people being able to interact, use it easily. That has also come up in the interviews, sort of on, I guess, the UI UX side of things of, we need wallets in more languages. Just being in English is a roadblock, or not just being in English, but to really make sure that we are providing tools that anyone anywhere can use. That I don't believe was something we were initially looking for, but I'm really glad that we're seeing that and learning that. Um, on that note, there were sort of 4 main points of what we hope the work could help accomplish that were set out from the beginning. One was looking at products and what needs to be built, or where do we think this innovation is going. And so I think that fits there. But more broadly, how can our work help policymakers? What factors are driving Bitcoin adoption? And then, as I was kind of just saying, what are some broader implications for this space moving forward? And then finally, let's just educate each other. Let's share what's going on and really, have something to point to about this space. Because once we have if we think about Bitcoin as this protocol for truth and a way to transfer value and information across the world, with this study as well, let's get the truth. Let's get the information, the facts, so that then we can really best react and plan moving forward.
And I think that as you do, hopefully do more studies, kind of
Yeah.
longitudinally over time, and I think you'll see adoption is increasing, use is increasing. This is a really valid tool. And then policymakers in other countries have to take it seriously, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they can actually see this as a tool and that they think about, okay, how can this benefit my country or what do I do for my people? And then you'll even see adoption increase over time. So there's definitely kind
Yeah.
of an exponential use case for these
Yes,
things. So.
absolutely. Yes, yes. Yeah. But thank
Well,
you,
thank you,
Renee,
Ella.
for,
This has been like
yes,
so awesome, and I'm like so super excited for the next one.
me too.
Maybe the next 2 or 3, because we have a lot of data to unpack, and maybe we can think
Yeah.
about thematic areas or whatnot. But I am so excited for your report coming out, and congratulations on all the hard work you've done and everything you've laid the groundwork for to get you this far. So
Thanks.
really appreciate your
Oh,
time
thank you.
and speaking with us about it.
My pleasure. No, thank you for having Sarah and I. And it's really, I consider it a huge gift to be able to partake in this project. So thank you again for having us.